Hello. So I have kind of gone down the rabbit hole, or maybe the wormhole, or some sort of hole, with this book, Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. I did a video previously, and you probably should watch that first if what I'm going to talk about now is going to make any sense. Again, I'd like to say that if you're not interested in hearing a discussion about dead animals, dead babies, dead humans, then please do not watch this video. So after my last video, I started taking a look at this Peter Singer's ideas and thinking about them in terms of some population limits, because it seems like population and the ability of there to be enough habitat to sustain that population is pretty critical to his arguments. But he kind of has this nebulous, idea of populations of animals and humans. And so I thought that if I could get that pinned down a little bit better, that maybe some of his ideas might make a little more sense to me. And so I thought I'd just quickly go over just some of the basic things in his book that he's talking about this through as a preference utilitarian. So he's trying to maximize preferences. This is different from traditional hedonistic utilitarianism, where you're trying to maximize happiness and reduce suffering. Similar, but a little bit different. He defines persons, which includes some animals and excludes some human beings, based on their awareness and level of interest in their future. And then he also includes the concept of considering the preferences of beings that don't yet exist. So in the case of if we had, are we concerned about global warming, and what are our actions going to do on people that do not yet exist in the future? Singer thinks that it's okay to take lives of beings that are not persons, even if it were unnecessary. And I had said that we have knowledge of the future of these non-persons, and so we should be concerned about their futures. And when we decide whether it's necessary or not to take life. And I was in my position that we should think that it should be something that's necessary before we take life. I have done a ton of writing here, and so mostly I'm just going to read through this to keep myself on track. And hopefully this makes some sense. Although not stated explicitly, Peter Singer's replaceability argument relies on understanding of the animal population within the limits of its habitat. And so he said that it was normally not okay to kill a wild animal, even if they are not a person, his definition of a person, something that can, thinks of itself, aware of itself, and thinks towards the future. Because you would simply be taking a life rather than replacing one animal with another. And he gave that example of hunting wild ducks. And as long as there was plenty of habitat and food for them to expand their population, then you shouldn't kill a duck, because you wouldn't be replacing it like you would in a situation of domesticated animals, where they would be limited to their area, and you would, an animal would have a baby, you could kill that baby and eat it, and there would still always be a population of animals there. However, he states that there would be nothing wrong with killing a wild animal if its population had grown too large to be supported by the available food within its range. It's not clear if he means killing both person and non-person animals in this case. That wasn't clear to me. He has already said that it would be okay to kill a happy domesticated animal that is not a person, and we must assume that he means killing offspring of animals located in some fixed area where there was enough food to maintain the population. And that's what I was talking about before. So we're talking about domesticated animals there. Singer also allows that humans can kill other animals, either persons or non-person animals, when there is an irreconcilable conflict between the animals and the basic survival needs of humans. So he clarifies that. And he says, when there is an irreconcilable conflict between the basic survival needs of animals and of normal humans, it is not speciesist to give priority to the lives of those with a biographical sense of their life and a stronger orientation towards the future. But what if humans are the cause? This is what I'm thinking. What if humans are the cause of animals not having enough habitat for their survival, either through human overpopulation and encroachment on their habitat, or through habitat degradation caused by humans? If humans are the cause of the irreconcilable conflict between animals and the basic survival needs of humans, then humans themselves would be creating the situation that we say allows us to kill those animals. For example, humans expand housing into areas where predators live, and then we kill them when they bother us. Or humans simply kill more wild animals for food as our population increases. And so we're saying Peter Singer is saying that it's okay for humans to kill any kind of animal if it's if we're starving or we have other, this is our basic survival needs at stake. But if we're actually, our overpopulation has caused us to run up against these animals and have these irreconcilable conflicts, then we're actually the cause that allows us to do the killing. And so shouldn't we think about that? And I had mentioned that at the very end of my video last time. So then Peter Singer's replaceability argument depends on population constraints. But while he does discuss in some detail how animal population plays into this idea, like I just discussed, he doesn't address how human population affects this argument. Does he assume that humans would always be allowed to expand their population to the point that we could displace and kill an unlimited number of animals as we continue to run into conflicts with them over our basic survival needs? Currently, many animals are extinct or in danger of becoming extinct as a result of human action. So we're kind of already seeing some of this. The only place where he mentions the interdependency of human and animal population is where he is putting forward a few initial arguments against the replaceability of just any domesticated animal before he makes his argument that would limit replaceability to non-person animals. And so let me just read that whole paragraph because it kind of gives you an idea. The only place in here where he really kind of talks about that. Oops. Still not in the right place. Okie dokie. So he says, if it is good to create happy life, then presumably it is good for there to be as many happy beings on our planet as it can possibly hold. Defenders of meat eating had better hope that they can find a reason why it is better for there to be happy people rather than just the maximum possible number of happy beings. Because otherwise, the argument implies that we should eliminate almost all human beings in order to make way for the much larger number of smaller happy animals that could sustainably replace them. If, however, the defenders of meat eating do come up with a reason for preferring the creation of happy people to, say, happy mice, then their argument will not support meat eating at all. For with the exception of some areas suitable only for pasture, the surface of our globe can support more people if we grow plant foods than if we raise animals. And so, yeah, this whole idea that really what a preference utilitarian or a hedonistic utilitarian is trying to do here is that we're just trying to get the maximum amount of happy beings that can be sustainably held on the earth. And so why would it be important that it be all human beings and not just like way more like a bunch of little mice and stuff, and there would just be way more happy beings? And so anyway, kind of talking about that, but it doesn't really help us with the argument, I don't think. So I went on to kind of look at what happens if we have, a certain number of animals and a certain number of humans. When I say animals, I realize that humans are animals, but I'm just going to use that, the term animal to refer to non-human animals throughout this. So let's look at Peter Singer's ideas more closely, this time putting hypothetical constraints on the population of both humans and animals. How would we determine what those maximum population numbers should be? Should we make it simple and choose a pre-industrial era population limit for all creatures? Or do we need to count the resources that modern people would require and balance this against the resources required to maintain animals? And then I was just thinking to myself, should humans be limited to living at the equator because we are naked mole rats and can't grow fur or feathers for warmth? So anyway, however we get there, let's assume that the human and animal population is constrained to some maximum limit to allow for healthy populations of both humans and animals on Earth, and that both humans and animals have a fixed and suitable amount of habitat to maintain their respective populations. And for the sake of simplicity, let's imagine that there is a region where most humans live and a separate great forest where most wild animals live. And that wouldn't necessarily mean that it's all forest. There could be, grasslands and whatever else, and oceans and things like that, right? But let's just look at it as we're living separately to make this scenario a little simpler. In looking at the scenario, humans can actually increase their maximum population limit by changing consumption habits. And Peter Singer had gotten at that as far as like if we didn't eat animals and we were eating more plants, then we would have, there could be more humans. For example, the same amount of land could support more humans if more plants were eaten rather than more animals as described above. Recycling metals would require less land for mining new metals. If we were simply more careful about how we handled our wastes, then there would be less environmental degradation, opening up more land for more humans. In this way, the human population limit could be larger, but at some point, there would still be some maximum human population that could be supported within our fixed habitat in order to remain in balance with the maximum animal population and its fixed habitat. So in this balanced habitat scenario, we can look at the situations in which Peter Singer suggests that a non-person animal could be replaced, or any animal, whether person or non-person, was in conflict with basic human survival needs and could be killed. And we could also look at the implications of his ideas about the replacement of non-person humans, including embryos, fetuses, and babies. So I was going to start talking about animals first. So let's look first at how this population scenario affects his argument as it concerns animals. He had said that humans should not kill even non-person animals in the wild as long as those animals had enough habitat to increase their numbers, because we would not be replacing them under those circumstances. As soon as those animals reach the limit where their habitat can no longer sustain them, then humans can kill them, even in situations when it's not necessary for basic human survival needs. But in this scenario where we have described a limited and balanced population of humans and other animals, as soon as the animals become overpopulated, then they would suddenly be infringing on the limited human habitat and therefore would be threatening the basic survival needs of humans, which would allow us to kill them. And when I say kill them, you could either kill them or manage their population in some other way. So there would never be a situation where it was not necessary for a human to kill a wild animal, either a person or a non-person animal. And so what I'm trying to say here is that Peter Singer had said that in the wild, if there was plenty of habitat still for wild animals to continue to populate and expand, then we shouldn't kill them, because we wouldn't be replacing them like we would in a domesticated animal situation. And also, if they did become overpopulated and started coming into our habitat, then they would be infringing on our ability to maintain our population. So that would be threatening our basic survival needs. And in that case, we could kill them, right? And so there would never be a situation where it would be like, we don't need to kill them, but we'll kill them anyway. So it would always be a necessary situation if, either underpopulated or populated wild animal situation. Hopefully that makes sense. So on the other hand, if there was an overpopulation of humans encroaching on the limited habitat of other animals, we shouldn't be surprised when large predators begin to attack us, or when the deer that used to live there begin eating the plants growing in our gardens. And we would know that the population problem was ours to remedy and not theirs. So, but what about all of the wild animals that didn't live out in the great forest and lived amongst humans? Because obviously there's going to be worms, and there's going to be bugs, and there's going to be birds and things like that amongst us, like there are now. Arguably, we could kill them all, because there would already be plenty of wild animals out there in the great forest, and the animals amongst us would be encroaching on our limited habitat. Possibly the smallest animals could stay, including the insects that we would need to pollinate our crops, and the birds and bats and frogs that would be needed to keep the insects in check. And then I was thinking, could we argue that humans would prefer to have animals around us, and so because of our preferences, we wouldn't want to kill them? But I said that doesn't seem to be the case, because certainly not for predators that might kill us or our pets or livestock. We seem to have gotten rid of all the bears and the weasels and other things that are, that we don't want to cause us harm, or our pets or our livestock. And certainly not nuisance animals like raccoons and possums and pigeons that we really don't want around. And definitely not slugs and snails that we have in our gardens that we would really love to get rid of if it was even possible to eradicate them. So it doesn't really actually seem that we want the animals around, because we're always trying to get rid of them. Maybe some birds would be acceptable, and like I was saying, we would need the insects and stuff for pollinating our crops that we eat. Would there be a place for domesticated animals in this scenario? In the case of domesticated non-person animals, Peter Singer has explained that humans could raise and replace them even when it is not necessary for our basic survival needs, because they aren't aware of their futures, and so it wouldn't make a difference. It is still unclear to which animals the definition of non-person would apply, animals that would also need to be killed painlessly and whose loss could not affect their comrades, as Peter Singer explains. Because those animals would be dependent on us and raised specifically for our benefit, the space for those animals would be carved out of the habitat allowed for humans. I mean, we couldn't be like, okay, we're going to put our domesticated animals out in the great forest. So they would have to be within our own habitat, and we would have to decide if the space that those animals require is worth the reduction in the human population to make room for them. And we kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. So in my previous video, I argue that even non-person animals who should not be killed unnecessarily. That's what I was saying. If you don't need to kill them, why would you kill them? If you could eat something different, why wouldn't you just do that? Even though they may not be aware of their own futures, because we are aware that they would prefer living the next day and the next day. In the population scenario that we are considering now, I've already explained why it would always be considered necessary to kill or otherwise reduce the population of wild animals living beyond their maximum limits, because they'd be encroaching on ours. But what about non-person domesticated animals living in a designated area where they are designed to be replaced, even if it isn't necessary for basic human survival needs? And I said I would continue to argue that these animals should only be killed if it were necessary for basic human survival needs, in such cases as human hunger or for life-saving treatments, experiments on animals, and things like that. So anyway, let's move on to humans. Changing the focus of our investigation, how would this balanced population scenario affect our dealings with other humans, specifically the non-person humans that Peter Singer describes, the embryos, fetuses, and babies, and the circumstances under which those humans could be replaced. And that word he's using. Peter Singer talked about the killing of an embryo, fetus, or baby in the context of an individual decision at the family level. But when he focuses on this decision of an individual woman, it leads to conclusions that beg more questions. I had more questions anyway. So let's consider that a woman could have 30 children in a lifetime, one baby per year from age 20 through 50. Let's consider a situation when a woman doesn't want to have any children at all, because we've determined that we must also consider the preferences of beings who do not yet exist, beings in the future, the preferences of a woman, including her preference not to have any children, must be weighed against the preferences of all of those 30 children that could exist in the future and their progeny. When we do this, I don't see how the preferences of the mother could ever outweigh the combined preferences of all her future children, simply because there are so many more of them, and therefore it would be morally wrong for her not to have the 30 children. So then, however, if all women within the human population, all of us in the world, had 30 children, then this would eventually lead to human overpopulation and the depletion of natural resources required to support the human population, which would affect the lives of those future children negatively, such that one woman and her preferences, including her preference not to have any children, would then outweigh those of the combined preferences that could not be met by those 30 miserable children and their progeny. So that's how that would actually go. In a situation where there was human overpopulation, and it could be argued that we are in that situation now, wouldn't it follow that it is morally wrong to have children, or according to preference utilitarianism? Clearly, there would need to be some number of human babies born each year in order to maintain ongoing generations, but that number would be limited to the maximum number in our population scenario. Otherwise, we would ensure that all the future generations combined could not meet many of their own preferences because the current generation is using up all of the resources to satisfy its preferences. So setting aside that for now, let's assume in the situation of overpopulation that the number of babies born each year did not exceed the maximum human population limit in our scenario. So we're not continuing to make an overpopulation problem. We would not be only looking at the decision of an individual woman to have children, but would look at the individual decision in the context of the whole human population. Some families might want no children, and others might want 2, and others might want 10, and that would be fine as long as there was a balance and continued overpopulation did not occur. So it wouldn't be all on one woman to have. At the same time, a woman could abort a fetus, and there would no longer be a focus on its replacement by another baby within a single family. Like I was just about to say, she wouldn't have to have a baby and then like, no, I don't want this one for whatever reason, and then need to have another one later to replace it, as Peter Singer suggested in his book. So with one woman needing to have another pregnancy in order to replace the one that she had just ended, because looking at it at the scale of the whole human population, a different woman could have a child and replace the baby for her. This gets to a question that I expressed in my last video. And in this case, where a baby could always be replaced by another, then no abortion could be deemed morally wrong. That's kind of what I concluded from thinking through that. Now, this is the thing. In his book, Practical Ethics, Peter Singer talks about a global warming scenario where we're looking at how beings that might exist in the future and how do our decisions affect them. He talks about kind of a sustainability things. If we change the way we're doing things now, how would that look in the future? Or a business as usual. If we were just to keep doing things as normal, how would that affect beings that would exist in the future? And he also talks about a party and go sort of situation. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but I just want to kind of try to highlight that he says here, but that does not mean that we should regard the thwarting of existing preferences as something that can be outweighed by creating new preference, whether in existing beings or in beings we bring into existence that will then satisfy them. So he's saying that what I'm talking about really isn't part of what he's arguing. So he's saying, thwarting an existing preference, well, a woman who does not want to have a child, it can't be outweighed by future beings and their preferences. But I honestly, and he goes on to make this argument. I'm not going to get into it because it's a little bit, yeah. Anyway, I don't know whether I just don't really understand or I just don't agree with what he's saying, because it seems to me that we really would need to weigh, as difficult as it is to look at it that way, the existing population and all of our preferences and all of those combined preferences of people that would live in the future and how our actions would affect all those folks. So anyway, Getting back on track with the population scenario that we have been exploring, we had been looking at the scenario where there was a human overpopulation. But what about a situation where there was human underpopulation? Presumably, those humans interested in maintaining a human population would have more children. But what if, in the circumstance of human underpopulation, an individual woman aborted a fetus and did not herself replace it with another child later? And what if a different woman didn't have a child to replace it for her in that population? It seems that the abortion would be considered morally wrong if we were to apply the replaceability argument consistently. The individual would have to weigh her own preferences against a future generation that would not be able to fulfill their more numerous preferences because they were not given life in a situation when there were plenty of resources to support them. So in that case, it seems like the opposite would be true. Well, then you really shouldn't have an abortion in the case of human underpopulation. Again, let's set aside this question, especially considering that we are not in danger right now dealing with a world with human underpopulation. And let's continue to look at our limited maximum population scenario. We've been talking about killing embryos and fetuses, but what about killing babies? Peter Singer places no significant moral difference between the killing of babies and the killing of fetuses and embryos. For some people, the idea of killing an embryo is as sad as killing a baby. But for others, the idea of killing a baby is much worse than killing an embryo. So I'm going to take a look at that. Peter Singer had talked about the continuum along which we might view the level of personhood of animals from the clam all the way up to the chimpanzee and view the impact of killing these animals differently. It seems that we could look on the embryo, fetus, and baby along some sort of continuum as well. Certainly the being has no concept of a future at any of those stages, but a baby could fulfill more preferences than a fetus, and an embryo would have no current preferences at all. We can't ignore our knowledge that the being at any stage could have a future as an adult human, but we also know that as it moves through the stages of pregnancy, there will be a difference in its sentience. So better to kill the embryo than the baby if the choice is to end the life regardless. So I thought that that might be a way of looking at, embryo, fetus, and baby. And there is a bit of kind of a differences there as far as if we're going to kill it, maybe we should kill it when it has no idea what's going on and is not experiencing anything. Having now thought more carefully about how our current human population is inextricably tied to the quality of life of the animals living now, and also the quality of life for future humans. So let me say that again. Having now thought more carefully about how our current human population is inextricably tied to the quality of life of animals living now, and also the quality of life for future humans, and thinking about how having no pregnancies is as limiting on life as aborting fetuses, then Peter Singer's idea that one baby could simply be replaced by another makes more sense. But it's not like all of these possible children who will never live in the world would not have been special individuals. We know that they would have had their own unique futures. Just as with our human friends, if one of our friends dies, we will still want friends and will make new ones. But a new friend does not replace that unique person that was our previous friend. What it really comes down to at the personal level is that we ourselves cannot live happy lives and at the same time be in constant mourning over the loss of each possible child through menstruation every month, with the randomness of the 300 eggs that might have hopped down the fallopian tube and the sperm that would have ended up making the connection. A miscarriage or abortion, and especially the loss of a baby, might have more personal impact than just not having children at all, deciding not to have children. But not because of some sterile criteria such as the level of sentience of that human being, but because that being has jumped through so many random hoops and come so close to having a full human life. And so I guess I'm just trying to say that, as a being gets closer to having the possibility of a full human life, then yeah, it just becomes, it's something that we probably would want to kind of take more seriously, but at the same time, we can't be so serious and so sad all the time about these possible humans, that we can't go on with our own lives and live a happy life ourselves. Up until now, I've been talking about establishing some maximum human population number in order to be aware of our impact and have the opportunity to work toward a goal of not being overpopulated. But it may be that we won't need any population plan at all, and that as humans, we will naturally regulate our population similar to other animals. I was just looking up, some zoologists in Canada looked at how Arctic ground squirrel populations were managed, and although some were lost to predation and many starved to death when there were limited resources, they also would end pregnancies. All they didn't know, it wasn't clear how they were ending their pregnancies. So, are we going to manage our own population? With human populations, we see some countries where there is a flattening or even a decrease in population, perhaps a natural awareness of the costliness of having more children, leading to decisions to have fewer children or none at all. Interesting that our most lethal predators are viruses and bacteria that are able to operate more easily in our densely populated world. As we become more populated and more interconnected, it's easier for them to kill us off than it was previously. Will a leveling out of human population and or ability to manage our wastes occur naturally before we have made irreparable changes to the natural world in which future generations will live? So what if, instead of constraining the human population, we allowed unlimited human expansion as it appears that we are doing now? So I've been talking about, well, let's be aware that we really should have a balanced population, allow animals to live and have some habitat where we live. But what if really we're looking at this as humans can increase our population as far as we want to, and we don't have to worry about the animals. According to Peter Singer, human preferences will almost always have more weight than the preferences of other animals when there is an irreconcilable conflict between the basic survival needs of humans and other animals. And as humans becomes more numerous, we will continue to find ourselves in situations of us versus them, and therefore other animals could ultimately be completely displaced by us. Would we naturally begin to constrain our population, or will we end up in a scenario where we displace most of the other animals? And if we begin to displace other animals, wouldn't we also begin to deplete non-animal entities, such as some plants that were not necessary for our survival? Our expansion would have to stop short of depleting the things that we depend on for life, including metals and minerals that we use, water that we drink, and plants that we eat, and the insects required to pollinate them. But what about the birds and bats and frogs required to keep the insects in check? We wouldn't be able to kill those off. It's curious that those things that are basic to human existence are the things that we've identified as either having no intrinsic moral value, or when we widen our moral sphere to include other animals, the lowly insect is labeled as a non-person. And so, kind of to conclude, an ethical system should help us determine if our human actions are right or wrong. Does Peter Singer's interpretation of preference utilitarianism give us good answers to questions about taking life? There is always a balance between individual needs and needs of society in which we live and upon which we depend. But does preference utilitarianism err too much on the side of the demands of society? Should individuals have more rights, mothers or babies, and non-human animals? If we look to those philosophers who focus more on individual rights, do they provide us with different answers? And so then I went back to, after having, and I did a video on this too, Tom Regan's book, The Case for Animal Rights. Tom Regan argues from a deontological ethical perspective rather than from the consequentialist or utilitarian perspective. He argues from, okay, let me start that again. So let's say this again. Tom Regan, in his book, The Case for Animal Rights, argues from a deontological ethical perspective rather than like Peter Singer's consequentialist or utilitarian perspective. He argues for a rights view, and that according to his theory, quote, certain individuals have moral rights, for example, the right to life, and they have these rights independently of considerations about the value of the consequences that would flow from recognizing that they have them, unquote. In his book, he concludes that mammals 1 year of age or older meet his definition of what he calls a subject of a life, based on beings who have desires and beliefs. And he adds that other beings may also be subjects of a life, but he is not trying to argue beyond mammals in this book. Thus, he states clearly that the argument in his book does not include rights for birds and fish, and certainly not insects, nor embryos, fetuses, or babies in the definition of subject of a life. So in order to afford other beings more protection, so like he's limited this definition of subject of life to just a certain number of humans and animals. So what about all the others? So in order to afford them some protection, Tom Regan states that it is, quote, better to adopt a policy that errs on the side of caution when the recognition of moral rights is at issue, unquote. And that sounds very similar to Peter Singer saying something similar. However, this is me talking, however, I would argue that it is clear that embryos neither have desires nor beliefs. So he's made this definition of somebody who has a subject of a life as having, they would need to have desires and beliefs. And so he's saying, but, I don't think fetuses and babies and embryos and birds and fish have beliefs and desires necessarily. He's not arguing that in this book. But then he's saying, well, let's err on the side of caution. Maybe they do. But however, I would argue that it is clear that embryos neither have desires nor beliefs. I mean, an embryo that doesn't even necessarily sense things and certainly does not have beliefs. And although fetuses may have desires, they may feel things, they may want things even at some stage, they certainly do not have beliefs. And when I say beliefs, it's kind of like, I know I really enjoy my breakfast. It tastes really good. I know that I'm going to have it tomorrow. I believe that it's going to be here tomorrow. The beliefs about things. Perhaps babies might have both desires and beliefs. At that stage, maybe they have a concept of, I'm going to get some milk in a little bit or something. But maybe not. But Tom Regan might save them from infanticide, whereas Peter Singer does not. But if both mothers and babies have rights, then how do we choose between the two? That's a question. But at the same time, it may be possible to say that many birds and fish have both desires and beliefs. And Tom Regan says that they might in his book. But it would be a stretch to say that animals such as worms and some insects have beliefs. They might have desires, but they probably don't have beliefs. And Tom Regan does not argue for the rights of insects. So it seems to me that neither Peter Singer nor Tom Regan give us a completely clear direction about which actions might be right or wrong in our decisions about taking life of humans and other animals. And they give little direction at all about how we should deal with other entities such as plants, metals, minerals, water, and air, which is something that I would like to address next. So in my previous video where I talk about Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation versus Tom Regan's book, The Case for Animal Rights, I had said that, they really don't come to, their conclusions really are not that different. And it's sometimes not very clear then, like, when would it be morally okay to take life or not? So anyway, I just wanted to kind of go through that. I've been just thinking a lot about it, thinking about because Peter Singer in his book, Practical Ethics, makes such a point of his argument really relying on habitat and populations. Are they underpopulated or overpopulated, and whether they can be replaced or killed, that we really do need to define what those habitats are. Are we talking about allowing animals a certain amount of habitat, or is it a situation where humans, we look at this as that humans can become as populated as they need to, as long as they can be sustained, even if that displaces other animals. So just kind of my thoughts on that. But I have different ideas about about whether our actions are right or wrong, which I would like to address in another video. And then hopefully I will call it good, because I need to get on with my life.